Hello, I'm Peter Apps. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Battle for the World, where I'm going to look behind the headlines and the hype, say what I think is going on, explain how I think we got to where we are today, and look at what might happen next. I'm going to try and deliver one of these videos a week, and the length is going to vary. I wanted to start by addressing some of the biggest questions that I get and explain to you in my own words why I think the things I do. Because this is a largely scripted video, I've also had the chance to think more carefully about the words that I use. So rather than on someone else's podcast interview where I'm answering in the moment, you should get a much better idea from this video exactly where I stand and why. That's particularly important because today, for the first in-depth video, I want to talk about what is in many ways the greatest question of our age: how close we might be to a major global conflict, whether we might already be in one, and if not, then how, when and where it's most likely to start. As many of you will know, this is something I've just written a book on. It's called The Next World War, The New Age of Global Conflict and the Fight to Stop It. It was published in Britain and most overseas territories in early 2026, and it will be out in the US from May. I'll be giving away 2 signed copies of that book to the 3 most interesting questions I get sent for future videos that come into my email, which is askpeter@swc-ventures.com. You can also find that email in the description, on my personal website, and later in this video. Those of you who've read the book or heard me talk about it will know that I usually say I think there's about a 35% chance of a major global war in the next 10 years. In other words, that it's a very significant possibility and something we have to prepare for, but also something that I think we can avoid. I still broadly stand by that opinion, and I'll explain why in a moment. But particularly since the book came out in January 2026, and even more since US President Donald Trump kicked off a major war in the Middle East by launching his Operation Epic Fury, I have found myself asked by more and more people whether the next world war might have already started. And of course, I can definitely see why people might think that. There are also others, particularly in Ukraine, who believe that what will one day come to be called the Third World War has in fact already started, perhaps with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, or even with President Putin's annexation of Crimea almost 8 years earlier. Once again, I can see why people think that, and there's no doubt that global tensions have been rising for a while. You can trace some of these fault lines back to Kosovo in 1999, or the Taiwan Strait crisis in 1996. And other points go back as far as the first millennium AD, when rival Viking and other European clans helped stake out what is now modern Russia and Ukraine, and Imperial China launched its first real shot at expanding onto nearby islands. But while I definitely agree that there are very real wars already underway in some parts of the world, not just Ukraine, but Sudan, Myanmar, and of course most recently across the Middle East. But I don't think any of them yet come close to the disruption, casualties, and the sheer appalling global scale that would come from a real new world war. And yes, that does still include, at least for now, what's happened in the Middle East. Not least because I still believe things will start to calm down there in the weeks and months to come. But I could be wrong. Every time the great powers get themselves into this sort of face-off, the lesson of history is that you can sometimes get appalling unintended consequences, even if you often don't. Before we go any further, I also want to draw attention to a point that people often miss. When we talk now about a major global conflict in the 2020s or 2030s, we seem to be thinking about something very different to what my parents or grandparents were thinking about during the last Cold War. When the Soviet Union and NATO first began their face-off at the end of World War II, and particularly as it escalated in the early 1950s, the initial expectation was that any war would be mostly conventional with some atomic bombs. The reason for that was simple. Initially, at least, atomic bombs were relatively small and very hard to build, so there weren't that many to go around on either side. To bring that down to what it really meant, for those leading NATO at the very start of the 1950s, their initial assumption was that if war came to Europe, the US might have as few as 20 nuclear bombs to use against the Russians. But that then changed at enormous speed, to the point that by the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, both sides had thousands of much larger hydrogen bombs that could destroy the world. Of course, we now know that this thermonuclear balance of terror was almost certainly the main reason the First Cold War never boiled over into something truly catastrophic. The situation now, however, is really very different, although it's not that easy to find a coherent explanation why. What does seem to have happened, though, is that particularly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the expectation has grown that any major clash between the superpowers, or whatever one calls them now, will almost certainly be initially conventional. When it comes to China fighting the US or Russia fighting NATO, that means that those doing the actual planning on both sides are working on the assumption that there could be fighting that could go on for perhaps several years, with all sides holding back on their nuclear arsenals as they try to win on the battlefield. Whether that is what would happen is a very different matter. We already have some guide to how those dynamics can play out, not just in Ukraine, but other smaller conflicts, such as the May 2025 four-day war between India and Pakistan. And we're beginning to see it in some of the Middle East exchanges between the US, Israel, and Iran. What happened between India and Pakistan in summer 2025, for example, was that they traded missiles and drones for each other for several days, but held back from much larger combat operations. That might be reassuring, but there are some very alarming elements. According to reports in places like the New York Times, Pakistan became sufficiently nervous about what was going on that it began moving its nuclear weapons towards the end of that four-day war, something that was observed by the US and which prompted the Trump administration to intervene through Secretary of State Marco Rubio to try to get a ceasefire. Something slightly similar is widely reported to have happened at the end of the first year of fighting in Ukraine. Towards October and November 2022, as Ukrainian forces pushed up towards Crimea, US officials began publicly briefing that they were very worried that Vladimir Putin would use an atomic weapon if he concluded that Crimea, and most particularly Russia's major naval base at Sevastopol, was about to fall to a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Exactly what happened then remains extremely murky, but by most accounts, the Americans became sufficiently worried that when it came to Ukraine's next fighting season in 2023, neither they nor the Europeans were willing to give Ukraine enough weaponry to really allow a breakthrough on the battlefield, and certainly not to threaten Crimea properly again. The fact that both those conflicts, India and Pakistan and Ukraine, developed a nuclear edge quite so early is one of the reasons I still believe on balance we're likely to avoid a major war. One of the reasons why I think it's only a 30 to 35% probability than maybe 55% or 70%. Both the US and Russia have huge atomic arsenals, and China is working fast to match their levels. And they both also have powerful conventional forces that might or might not overmatch those that they end up fighting, particularly if the US sits back on the sidelines. But as long as they are nervous that things might end up going nuclear, they may well just not be prepared to take the risk of starting a major war. This isn't, though, as reassuring as it might be, because if history teaches nothing else, it's that leaders make mistakes. We saw this in 2026 with Donald Trump's Operation Epic Fury against Iran, designed to deliver a quick and simple victory, and of course it did nothing of the kind. Vladimir Putin did the same with Ukraine, and that suggests these miscalculations may be becoming much more common. We already have evidence that those in charge in Moscow and Beijing have particular areas of territory that they would like to seize, and which they believe they might be able to take if America stands back. And that brings me to the last part of the video, the flashpoints that worry me the most. The first one is Taiwan. We'll return to this again in other videos, but right now I would still say it's the single most dangerous flashpoint in the world because it's the hardest to resolve by peaceful means. Right now, we know that Xi Jinping and the Chinese state remain determined to assert control over that island as soon as possible, and definitely by 2049, the anniversary of the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War. We also know that on Taiwan itself, there is very little popular support for a Chinese takeover. Taiwan is the first true Chinese ethnic democracy in history, and its citizens are very proud of that. It also has a significant non-Chinese indigenous population who are even more opposed to being dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, and while they make up only 1% of the population, they are some half of special forces. The US and Japan also have their own reluctance to make sure an invasion doesn't go ahead, although exactly what that means we'll get into in a future video. We will also talk more about the Taiwan Relations Act and the complexities of strategic ambiguity that mean that the United States in particular is deliberately vague over what it would do if China does invade. The bottom line, though, is that in my opinion, that deliberate vagueness may well increase the danger. And if Beijing does attack Taiwan in the current decade or the next, there are plenty of people who believe that that might swiftly trigger the largest, widest war since World War II. In fact, the danger of war over Taiwan is sufficiently significant that it is seen by plenty of military experts and top commanders in Europe as the most likely single trigger for a conflict there as well. The logic for that is simple. For all the nervousness that Donald Trump might quit NATO or that political strains within Europe might tear apart alliances, the most dangerous single moment for the European continent would come if the US was suddenly distracted by a major war with China. As one senior Danish officer put it to me, if the Americans and Chinese fight, I think we will all fight each other. Otherwise, there will not be a war. Still, there are several places where conflict could break out in Europe, whether or not China moves against Taiwan. And unsurprisingly, the places that worry me most are those areas of NATO territory that were once part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I want to talk a lot more about the First Cold War in other of these videos, but the most important thing to remember is that while most countries in the Eastern Bloc, like Poland, Romania and Hungary, remained independent nations in the Warsaw Pact after 1945, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania were absorbed entirely into the Soviet Union itself. Perhaps even more importantly, several of those nations, particularly Latvia and Estonia, still contain considerable Russian-speaking populations. The largest single settlement by far in that regard is the eastern Estonian city of Narva, located exactly on the border of the Russian Federation, with its 50,000 population almost entirely Russian-speaking. I want to come back in my next video to those tensions on NATO's Eastern European frontier, but for now it's important to remember that any Russian attack on NATO member nations would bring it almost immediately into conflict with both European and US NATO troops who are already based there at the moment. Alongside that, we also still have the separate risk of existing conflict and confrontation spreading from non-NATO member states, not least the Ukraine war getting out of hand, or Russia and its enemies finding themselves in a fight over nations like Georgia or Moldova. Looking at the wider world, I would also point back to India and Pakistan. That 4-day war last year might have been over very quickly, but we'll look in future episodes into ways that confrontation is continuing to escalate. Nor, of course, have we seen the last of conflicts from the Middle East. I still think the world can manage that, and we'll get through this in one piece, but there are plenty of ways in which this could go wrong, and one of the reasons I started this channel is to deepen understanding and discussion. I'll also be taking questions, so if you've got anything you want to know about how I see the world or even the rest of my life, then you should email askpeter@swc-ventures.com. So SWC Ventures, by the way, is my new company, Saltwater Crocodile Ventures, named for the famous Australian crocodile that can lose its limbs and still remain lethal. So that's me, Peter Apps, and that was the first episode of my new podcast, Battle for the World. First also product for Saltwater Crocodile Ventures. Take care, please share, subscribe, and I'll see you back here very soon.